In this episode of On Subrogation, we're going to talk about one of the most effective ways to recover subrogation funds, the post-judgment license suspension. I'm your host, Kim Rathbone. Now, this is one of the hardest lessons for uninsured drivers to learn. They can lose their driver's license by driving without proper insurance. This is because there are state financial responsibility laws that require you to have insurance or enough money saved up to pay a certain amount of damages in each state that are resulting from a car accident. Now, this seems like it's a simple process, but there are a lot of details to pay attention to. The first one, does your state even allow license suspensions post-judgment? Most do, but there are a couple that don't. Connecticut hasn't allowed post-judgment suspensions for quite some time, but Vermont was the most recent state to void the previous rule that it had permitting license suspensions to occur. Another nuance that's involved is the time to file. Now, some states have requirements where the license suspension has to occur within a certain time of the date of the judgment. So, for example, California requires any license suspension to occur within 3 years from the date of judgment. Another component to pay attention to is the length of time that a license suspension is valid. Most of the states say that a license suspension is valid until a judgment is satisfied. There are a few states that have a time component where it is the license is no longer suspended after a certain amount of time. An example of this is Alaska, and that has a 3-year time period. You could shorten that 3 years by satisfying the judgment or coming up with a payment arrangement that's acceptable to the insurer. But if not, at the 3-year mark, that license is no longer going to be suspended and will become valid. There are also requirements that the BMVs have in order to process any license suspension, and those usually start with identifiers. What identifiers are ways to identify the people who the BMV is being notified may have been driving without insurance. And they include a date of birth, social security number, the license number, the address sometimes for the tortfeasor, and the plate of the vehicle. Most of the BMVs want at least 2 identifiers. But Ohio wants 3 identifiers. Now, you might think that you always need the license number itself in order to request a license to be suspended and notify the BMV of that. However, there are several states that will process 2 identifiers, with one of them not being the license number itself. There are many different procedures required by the different BMVs in each state. Some of them are quite simple. In the state of Ohio, they only require the letter with the identifiers and the notification. But there are states like Minnesota that require particular forms. And one of the things to pay attention to is that these forms can change over time. Very recently, Louisiana just changed its license suspension forms. Most of the time, the BMV will notify you when you have used a form that they consider to be an older form. Many also require a police report or an incident form if the police report does not exist, was never filed. Tennessee is an example of that one. And if there is insurance that's listed on the police report, generally the BMVs are going to request a copy of the coverage denial from the insurance carrier for the tortfeasor, showing that the insurance that looks like it's valid on the police report isn't actually covering the incident itself. There are some states like Pennsylvania that require copies of the judgment to be attached to any letter, and some states even require that copy of the judgment to be certified, like Rhode Island. There are other states that have extremely complicated procedures by requiring any notification of the BMV to be done through the court itself. Indiana is an example of that. Something that many people don't know exists is you can have reciprocal license suspensions in certain states. Not all of them, but certain states will permit, if you have a license suspended in one, you receive notification that a tortfeasor now has a license in a new state. A state like Oregon will honor the original license suspension from the original state. But there are some states that require you to domesticate the judgment. I often get asked about confirmations of whether the license was suspended or not. Now, some states just don't send confirmations at all. Indiana is one of them, but many do, although it's very highly irregular. But all of them send rejections when there is an issue and the letter regarding the license could not be processed. The general rule is you can consider the license to be suspended as long as there is no rejection that's received without requiring the confirmation to be obtained as well. Now, some BMVs have websites where you can log on to see if a license is valid or if it's in a suspended status. However, many of those websites have some sort of disclaimer stating that you're only looking up your own driver's license when using the website. So therefore, if you're looking to see if a tortfeasor's license is suspended or valid, that's an improper action if the website has that disclosure on it. Now, one question I often get is whether you can do a suspension when there was insurance involved. Now, this comes up when an insurance company denies for non-cooperation, or there's insurance but it might be an excluded driver. The requirement is that insurance has to be maintained for state minimum thresholds, or the tortfeasor must pay the claim themselves. So the BMV can suspend licenses should it choose to. My recommendation before sending a letter to the BMV is to send a letter to the tortfeasor to notify them that the insurance isn't paying and ask them to contact the insurance company. That will often prompt cooperation by the tortfeasor, thereby allowing you to recover the claim. It's also possible to resuspend the license of a tortfeasor, although some states don't allow it after a certain time period if the judgment goes dormant or isn't renewed. And Ohio is an example of that one. Now, many BMVs want a copy of the agreement and an assertion of the failure to pay in order to process the license suspension. Ohio is an example of that. They want to avoid the situation where you've suspended the license, the BMV has suspended the license, the tortfeasor then makes a payment arrangement, gets the license back, stops paying almost immediately, and then the circle continues, resuspended, pay, stop pay. The BMV just doesn't want to be burdened with too much paperwork under those circumstances. Once a resuspension occurs, some states like Ohio will only allow the reinstatement of a license for a payment or settlement in full. Now, BMV rejections, these are important to pay attention to. If they're rejecting, they might pass on insurance information, indicating how insurance actually does apply that they obtain from the tortfeasor, or it could be that there are other parties that have some form of coverage. Now, when there is a rejection that's received and it doesn't really make sense as to why the license suspension wasn't processed, we recommend calling the BMV to discuss this with one of the clerks. It could be that they've misunderstood what you were trying to say, or maybe they're just new. To help you, we've got some procedural recommendations. In terms of language, just advise the BMV to find the attached document and that they may take appropriate action under the state's financial responsibility laws. It's the BMV that's suspending the license, not the subrogating insurer. When notifying the BMV, send a copy to the tortfeasor as well. Sometimes that prompts a very fast response from the tortfeasor directly to you in order to stop the BMV from processing the license suspension and hopefully obtain recovery or a payment arrangement. Of course, when the payment arrangement is reached and a release is necessary, extremely promptly draft a letter notifying the BMV. Encourage the tortfeasor to take the copy themselves to the BMV. Remind them that the BMV might have their own requirements to reinstate a license like proof of insurance. And then of course there's those particularly complicated ones like Indiana, again, where the release has to be processed through the court. Thanks for joining me for this episode of On Subrogation. Please subscribe to our channel to see other educational videos on subrogation claims. I'm Kim Rathbone. That's the long and short of it.